Before we begin this investigation, you should adjust your expectations. What you are about to examine is not a devotional text, nor a piece of symbolic poetry to be interpreted loosely. The records indicate that Pistis Sophia contains one of the most complex cosmological frameworks of any early esoteric manuscript. If you remain through the entirety of this analysis, you will see why its opening chapter plays a far larger role than most commentators acknowledge. For Omniscient, this is not an exercise in mysticism. It is an attempt to dissect a document that blends theological innovation, psychological insight, and cryptic cosmology into a single, tightly constructed narrative. The document opens with an unusual claim. After his resurrection, Christ allegedly remained with the disciples for a span described as many years, delivering teachings that, according to the text, had never been spoken in the world. Although the dating is debated, the narrative suggests a long interval in which secret instruction took place away from public observation. Sources suggest that this prolonged period served to prepare the disciples for exposure to a layered cosmology that ordinary listeners would not have tolerated or understood. The implication is clear. The text asserts that perception itself had to be restructured before any higher revelation could be processed. The first mystery emerges in the initial lines, when Christ allegedly warns the disciples that the heavens contain orders and realms beyond human endurance. The text insists that these regions are not static chambers, but dynamic forces that respond to the inner condition of the observer. According to the narrative, an unprepared mind confronted with such structures would collapse under the weight of their intensity. Scholars who approach this text cautiously have noted that this description resembles altered states of consciousness reported in various esoteric traditions, though the document frames it as literal cosmic geography. One passage states that Christ had traversed all the eons, breaking what the text calls bindings that restricted luminous beings. Whether the term bindings refers to metaphysical constraints or symbolic limitations remains uncertain. However, the authors of the document clearly intended to portray Christ's journey not simply as a descent into darker realms, but as an intervention that restored order in regions described as unstable since ancient ages. This is where the narrative begins to depart from conventional teachings, suggesting that even high celestial zones can degrade or become imbalanced. Another noteworthy detail appears when Christ speaks of the universe as a responsive organism. The document claims that certain regions vibrate with harmony, while others respond like wounds, shaped by the desires and actions of countless beings. Modern interpreters usually skip this, yet it may be among the most revealing metaphors in the entire text. If taken symbolically, it implies that human emotions mirror cosmic conditions, suggesting a reciprocal relationship between inner states and outer structures. If taken literally, the document proposes a universe with variable stability influenced by conscious entities. A central proclamation in this opening section reads, "Receive now the light promised from the beginning, for only it can remove the veil of worlds beyond human understanding." Forensic reading suggests this line refers not to physical illumination, but to a cognitive or perceptual shift. The light operates as a form of heightened awareness, granting the disciples the ability to discern forces influencing their thoughts. The text repeatedly claims that human perception is not autonomous, but subject to interference by beings inhabiting the lower eons. In modern terms, it resembles a treatise on psychological influence framed in mythological language. Then comes a crucial warning. Christ allegedly tells the disciples that entities will attempt to distort whatever knowledge they receive. These forces, according to the document, do not primarily attack through violence, but through confusion. The concern expressed here is epistemic. The threat is not destruction, but disorientation. This is consistent with several ancient traditions describing deception, illusion, and misperception as tools used against seekers of truth. The narrative suggests that misinformation is more dangerous than direct harm, a concept very familiar in 21st century discourse. The final section of this chapter frames the disciples as participants in an examination. The text implies that the revelations they are about to receive must be earned through internal discipline rather than passive listening. Allegedly, the mysteries require moral stability, emotional control, and clarity of intention. If these conditions are not met, the document warns that the revelations themselves could become distorted within the mind of the listener. This is not unique to Pistis Sophia. Several ancient writings suggest that knowledge can either elevate or destabilize, depending on the state of the recipient. When viewed through a forensic lens, the opening of Pistis Sophia reads less like a supernatural chronicle and more like a coded instruction manual for navigating cognitive, ethical, and existential layers of reality. Sophia's descent into the lower eons will soon mirror the psychological descent of any person confronting uncertainty, fragmentation, and desire. Before we analyze her first cry for help, it is essential to recognize that the text has already built an intellectual and emotional framework. Higher knowledge is dangerous, perception can be manipulated, and truth demands internal alignment. With this foundation established, we can now proceed to the next part of our investigation, where Sophia's first plea exposes the mechanisms of deception and vulnerability that the text claims operate in the lower strata of existence. Before we move deeper into the case of Pistis Sophia, you should prepare yourself for a shift in framework. The records indicate that what happens next is not merely a spiritual lament, but the earliest detailed description of psychological destabilization framed as cosmic descent. If you stay with this analysis through the end of this segment, you will see why Sophia's first plea for help has been misinterpreted for centuries. Omniscient exists to bring forward the details others overlook. And in this portion, the overlooked material radically alters how we understand this ancient narrative. The document states that Sophia, identified as a luminous intelligence, perceived a distant radiance she believed to be the ultimate source of truth. Sources suggest that this light may represent either an idealized perception or an external stimulus beyond her comprehension. Whatever its nature, the text claims she advanced toward it without authorization from the higher realms. Scholars note that this is not framed as rebellion. Instead, it is framed as misjudgment, a premature leap towards something that resembled truth but was not truth itself. This distinction is crucial. The narrative does not condemn her, but uses her miscalculation to illustrate how perception can be compromised. As Sophia descends, she realizes too late that the light she followed did not belong to the highest region, but was a distorted reflection produced by forces occupying the lower strata. These forces, according to the text, are called Archons. Their role is ambiguous. Some interpretations portray them as malevolent, while others consider them regulatory beings of a compromised system. The Pistis Sophia text does not accuse them of evil directly. Instead, it alleges that they thrive on instability and exploit confusion. Their influence appears to consist of psychological interference feeding doubt, amplifying fear, and creating false sensory impressions. Sophia's first documented cry is recorded as a lament, in which she states that she has fallen into regions of chaos and is surrounded by those who hate the light. Investigators who read this symbolically argue that she is describing the collapse of discernment. She followed a signal she expected to lead upward, but instead entered a domain in which her inner clarity fractured. The language of chaos corresponds with descriptions of emotional turbulence in other ancient texts, reinforcing the hypothesis that this passage blends metaphysical imagery with psychological allegory. One of the most important but least cited details is the text's claim that Sophia's own light becomes distorted by the density of the environment she has entered. This is not merely a poetic metaphor. The authors appear to be describing a feedback loop. The more destabilized her perception becomes, the more fragmented her inner light grows, and the more susceptible she becomes to further manipulation. From a forensic perspective, this suggests that the narrative is documenting a collapse of cognitive stability presented through esoteric symbolism rather than clinical language. The Archons allegedly intensify this instability by projecting what the text calls false forms of light. These projections, according to the narrative, mimic the legitimate signal she sought earlier, creating an environment where she cannot reliably determine what is authentic. In modern terms, it resembles exposure to misleading stimuli crafted to manipulate judgment. The fact that the text repeatedly describes these lights as reflections rather than independent sources is notable. It suggests they lack intrinsic stability, functioning instead as illusions created through distortion. The most revealing component of the first plea appears when Sophia admits that she advanced without guidance. This admission receives little attention in traditional commentary, yet it may be the key to interpreting the entire episode. She is not punished for moral failure. She is overwhelmed because she attempted to navigate a layered system without adequate preparation. Her lament includes the line that her strength has left her, which investigators interpret as a recognition that her internal coherence has eroded. This level of self-commentary is rare in ancient esoteric texts and indicates an acute awareness of personal vulnerability. Christ's response to the disciples regarding this situation is perhaps the most intriguing element. The text states that he explains Sophia's fall as the consequence of mistaking reflected brilliance for true illumination. Allegedly, he tells them that such reflections exist in multiple layers of the cosmos and that they are designed, if the text is taken literally, to mislead even advanced beings. If taken symbolically, the statement reads like an observation about emotional impulses or cognitive biases that imitate wisdom but lack its grounding. Either interpretation frames the episode as an encounter with deception more subtle than outright darkness. The plea concludes with Sophia asking for restoration. She admits her error and requests intervention. Investigators note that the document portrays this request not as defeat, but as the point at which the recovery process becomes possible. According to the narrative, the higher realms cannot act until the afflicted entity reorients toward truth. This principle appears repeatedly in esoteric literature. The idea that assistance must be consciously invited, not imposed. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the implication is that clarity begins with acknowledgement of disorientation. By the time the plea ends, Sophia is trapped in a system of confusion, where images, sounds, and impressions are controlled by forces with unclear motives. Her vulnerability escalates, and her cries travel across multiple layers, initiating the next phase of the story: the confrontation between the stabilizing presence of Christ and the destabilizing influence of the Archons. The next portion of our investigation will examine this confrontation carefully, because it reveals how the text interprets psychological interference as a coordinated attempt to fragment consciousness. Before we continue, you should be aware that this section marks a turning point in the Pistis Sophia narrative. The documents imply that what happens next is not a simple spiritual struggle, but a coordinated attempt to dismantle Sophia's inner coherence. If you stay through the end of this segment, you will see how the ancient authors describe psychological fragmentation using the language of archons, eons, and cosmic interference. For Omniscient, this is where the case becomes more technical, because the text's symbolism requires careful decoding to avoid both sensationalism and oversimplification. According to the manuscript, once Sophia's first plea echoed through the lower regions, the Archons intensified their actions. The text states that they moved against her, a phrase that, in forensic analysis, appears to describe intrusion rather than physical pursuit. Scholars suggest that these Archons represent destabilizing forces that exploit weakened perception. The document portrays them as entities that do not attack with brute force, but with influence that reshapes thoughts and emotional states. Their power comes from their ability to amplify whatever fear or confusion already exists. One of the most striking claims made by the text is that these Archons can generate images and impressions that mimic the appearance of light. The records indicate that this is not a random phenomenon. The false light vibrates irregularly, which the narrative uses to distinguish it from authentic illumination. Modern readers might recognize this as an allegory for misinformation or distorted intuition. The text insists that the Archon's projections appear convincing precisely because they contain fragments of truth mixed with distortion. This hybrid nature is what allegedly misleads consciousness at vulnerable moments. Sophia, still destabilized, attempts to sing a second plea. The manuscript describes her voice as interrupted by the Archon's interference. Some commentators interpret this interruption as symbolic of intrusive thoughts, while others take it as literal cosmic obstruction. The narrative states that the Archons generate a type of noise that blends with her cry, making it difficult for her to maintain clarity. Whether metaphorical or literal, the description aligns with experiences of cognitive overload where distress and external pressure combine into a single, overwhelming sensation. Christ's explanation to the disciples deepens the forensic significance of this segment. He claims that the Archons attempt not only to deceive Sophia, but also to hinder his own approach. According to the text, these beings create veils that prevent the higher light from being detected. Sources suggest that these veils may represent layers of fear or inherited patterns that block awareness. In psychological terms, this resembles the phenomenon in which a distressed mind becomes less receptive to guidance. The text frames this as a systemic resistance embedded in the structure of the lower eons. Another overlooked element appears when Christ asserts that he encountered barriers made of accumulated fear from countless generations. This detail often goes unnoticed, yet it is crucial. It implies that the lower realms are shaped not only by autonomous entities, but also by the emotional residue of sentient beings. If interpreted symbolically, the text portrays fear as a structural force, capable of influencing the environment in which consciousness operates. If interpreted literally, it suggests a cosmos where emotional energy has material consequences. The manuscript then presents one of its most psychologically revealing claims. The Archons distort the inner light of the soul by wrapping it in layers of density. This does not extinguish the light but obscures it, making the soul doubt its own origin. Forensic interpretation suggests the authors understood the phenomenon of self-doubt as something externally intensified. The battle becomes internal because the external pressure reshapes the internal landscape. The text frames this as the true danger, far more serious than any external threat. Sophia attempts to resist, but the document states that her efforts are undermined by images of failure projected by the Archons. Investigators note that this mirrors the concept of intrusive imagery found in trauma responses. These internal visions are treated by the narrative as weapons used to destabilize identity. The text does not portray Sophia as weak. It portrays her as overwhelmed by an environment engineered to exploit her vulnerabilities. From an analytical point of view, this description is extraordinarily sophisticated for an ancient work. What follows next is one of the most debated passages. Christ states that the Archons draw energy from Sophia's destabilized state, suggesting that the lower eons absorb misaligned light as a means of sustaining themselves. Allegedly, their power depends on maintaining confusion. This again parallels psychological frameworks, where negative mental states reinforce themselves by consuming attention and vitality. The manuscript describes this as a cycle in which confusion strengthens the very forces that create it. Despite all this, the text insists that Sophia retains a minimal but persistent spark of genuine light. Christ emphasizes that, as long as this spark remains, total collapse is impossible. Scholars often overlook this line, yet it may be the most crucial in the entire chapter. It indicates that the text views consciousness as fundamentally resilient. Even when buried under layers of distortion, it still emits a signal that higher realms can detect. The segment concludes with a subtle shift. Sophia continues to call for help, and the narrative claims that this call creates a rift in the dense layers around her. Christ states that no Archon can completely close this opening once the soul reorients toward truth. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the implication is the same. Recognition of confusion weakens its grip. Ancient writers rarely described internal struggle with such structural clarity, making this passage unusually valuable for modern investigation. In the next segment of our analysis, we will examine Christ's traversal of the eons and the cosmological mechanics behind Sophia's entrapment and recovery. Whether this describes metaphysical geography or a symbolic map of consciousness, the details are uniquely precise. Before entering this next phase of the investigation, you should pause and adjust your frame of reference. The section we are about to analyze is the most structurally complex portion of the Pistis Sophia narrative. If you stay until the end of this segment, you will understand why researchers, linguists, and historians disagree sharply about whether the document presents literal cosmology, psychological allegory, or a hybrid system preserved from earlier traditions. For Omniscient, this is where we examine the architecture itself, the 13 eons. Sources suggest that the text uses the term eons not as a measurement of time, but as layered domains of existence. Investigators note that these domains function like independent ecosystems, each shaped by the consciousnesses that inhabit them. The manuscript presents the eons as arranged from subtle regions of luminosity down into dense regions of conflict and fragmentation. This gradient is essential to the structure of the narrative. According to the document, Sophia's fall was not a simple downward plunge, but a rapid traversal through these levels, destabilizing her perception with each passing layer. Christ's explanation to the disciples provides the forensic foundation for this analysis. He allegedly states that every eon contains both inner and outer orders, each governed by forces that regulate movement and perception. Scholars have observed that this resembles early cosmological models in which the universe is divided into nested spheres. However, Pistis Sophia adds a psychological component. The eons respond differently depending on the state of the traveler. A stable consciousness passes through without distortion. An unstable consciousness experiences intensified fragmentation. One of the most revealing details appears when Christ describes his own passage through these regions. The manuscript asserts that he moved through them unseen, not because he hid, but because the eons could not register his presence. This implies that the higher light he carried operated beyond the perceptual range of the lower realms. Whether metaphorical or not, the text seems to propose a hierarchy of perception where only beings of similar vibratory structure can detect one another. This becomes relevant later when Sophia struggles to detect genuine help amid the false lights produced by the Archons. The central eon, the seventh, receives special attention. The manuscript describes it as a transitional boundary where light and shadow coexist in delicate equilibrium. This is not portrayed as a battleground but as a zone of ambiguity, where beings often mistake partial knowledge for complete understanding. Christ allegedly tells the disciples that many entities remain trapped here for long periods because they believe they have reached the highest layer. Sources suggest that Sophia passed through this region shortly before her fall, and the text hints that her misinterpretation of reflected light originated there. Investigators find it significant that the text does not present the eons as rigidly guarded spaces but as domains with gatekeepers whose responses mirror the internal state of the traveler. If the traveler carries fear, the gatekeeper reflects fear. If the traveler carries clarity, the gatekeeper allows passage. This mechanism differs from the punitive cosmologies of many later traditions. Instead, it resembles a feedback system built into the fabric of the universe, a system that tests coherence rather than loyalty. Sophia's descent becomes more intelligible when viewed through this lens. The manuscript claims that she moved too quickly, drawn by a signal she interpreted as superior light. As she crossed eon after eon, each layer altered her perception further, amplifying her misconceptions. Investigators note that this resembles the process by which a mistaken assumption cascades into larger errors when not corrected early. By the time she reached the lower realms, the document states that she could no longer differentiate between authentic resonance and distorted reflection. One of the most controversial claims appears in this portion of the text. Certain eons allegedly draw energy from beings who descend into them. According to Christ's explanation, these regions have been unstable since ancient disruptions, and they maintain balance by absorbing fragments of misaligned light. When Sophia entered these domains, her confusion became a resource for the environment itself. Forensic interpretation suggests that this passage may represent the draining effect of prolonged emotional or cognitive instability, framed here in mythological terms. The manuscript continues with a statement that has sparked debate for centuries. Christ claims that while traveling through the eons, he performed acts of restoration, repairing distortions and rebalancing structures affected by ancient conflict. If taken symbolically, this describes the reorganization of a fractured psyche. If taken literally, it depicts a cosmic intervention to stabilize domains damaged long before the events of the narrative. What matters for our investigation is that the text frames Christ not merely as a rescuer of Sophia, but as a restorer of the environment that contributed to her fall. The document records that when Christ finally reached the deepest eon where Sophia was trapped, he found her inner light still active, though heavily obscured. This detail is crucial. Despite the distortion, her core signal had not disappeared. Ancient commentators often overlook this line, yet it carries significant weight in forensic analysis. It suggests that the authors considered consciousness fundamentally resilient, even under extreme distortion. The narrative asserts that this residual light enabled the higher realms to locate her. Sophia's condition at this moment is described with striking precision. The manuscript states that she could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and the impressions imposed by the Archons. Her perception was not merely clouded, but intertwined with external interference. Modern psychological frameworks would classify this as fragmentation, where internal and external impulses blur into a single field of experience. The esoteric framing of the text encodes this in metaphysical language, but the underlying phenomenon appears remarkably consistent with descriptions of cognitive overload. When Christ reestablishes contact with her, the manuscript claims that the environment itself reacts. The lower eons shake, as if resisting the stabilizing effect of the higher light. Whether literal or symbolic, the imagery presents a conflict between order and entropy. The stabilizing presence disrupts the dynamics that sustain the lower domains. This reaction becomes the foundation for the fourth and fifth mysteries, where the narrative introduces the concept of a name or vibration capable of reorganizing the entire system. Before we advance into those mysteries, it is essential to recognize what this segment establishes. According to the text, Sophia did not fall because of moral failure, but because of misinterpretation within a layered cosmos whose structures respond to perception. Her journey through the 13 eons, as presented here, is less a tale of punishment and more a technical description of what happens when consciousness moves too quickly toward what it believes is truth. Before we enter the fifth stage of this investigation, you should know that what follows is the most controversial portion of the Pistis Sophia manuscript. If you remain with this analysis until the end of this segment, you will understand why specialists debate the authenticity, symbolism, and even the intended meaning of the so-called ineffable name. For Omniscient, this section is not about mysticism. It is about examining a claim that an ancient text attributes to Christ. The idea that a non-verbal vibrational force can reorganize consciousness, disrupt hostile systems, and restore what the lower realms distorted. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, this portion is central to the narrative. According to the document, Christ approaches Sophia while the Archons attempt to conceal her location behind layers of distortion. The manuscript states that he appears in a light the Archons cannot withstand. Investigators stress that this phrase is not presented as metaphor. The text claims that the light itself has an effect on the environment, generating reactions that resemble destabilization. If interpreted symbolically, the light could represent clarity so intense that confusion cannot coexist with it. If taken literally, it suggests the presence of a higher energetic signature incompatible with the lower domains. Sophia's reaction is immediate. The text says she recognizes the presence before seeing it, as though the light reactivates a dormant memory within her. This recognition is significant. It implies continuity between her original state and her current fragmented condition. Even in distress, she retains an internal signal capable of responding to the higher light. Scholars note that this becomes the basis for her restoration. The manuscript does not present her as inert, but as responsive, even in weakness. The Archons, however, do not retreat. The document states that they release increasingly chaotic projections, irregular pulses of light, fragmented sounds, and distortive impressions to drown out Sophia's recognition. Forensic analysis suggests this represents intensified psychological interference. The more clarity approaches, the more aggressively confusion asserts itself. This pattern is consistent with descriptions of cognitive dissonance and emotional turbulence recorded across various mystical and psychological traditions. It is in this moment that Christ allegedly invokes the ineffable name. The manuscript emphasizes that this name is not a word, not a sound, and not a linguistic construct. It is described as a movement or vibration emitted from the highest region. Ancient commentators debated this claim intensely. Some believed it referred to an advanced mantra, others to an unspoken principle of order. Modern investigators often interpret it as a metaphor for a stabilizing force, something that reorganizes perception at a fundamental level. Regardless of interpretation, the text insists that the name initiates a restructuring effect. The narrative claims that when the name is invoked, the environment reacts instantly. The Archons lose coherence, the false lights flicker and collapse, and the distortive impressions dissolve. This is not framed as a battle, but as a system reverting to equilibrium when exposed to its original organizing principle. In symbolic terms, the name functions like a calibration signal. In literal terms, the text presents it as a force capable of overriding lower structures. The authors seem to portray it as a form of truth so complete that deception cannot coexist alongside it. Sophia's internal state changes accordingly. The manuscript states that her fragmented thoughts align themselves, an expression that is strikingly precise. Scholars have noted that the text rarely uses language implying psychological reconfiguration, yet here it does so openly. If interpreted symbolically, the name restores cognitive coherence. If taken literally, it reactivates the pattern of her original luminosity. In either case, the implication is the same. The reorganization comes from an external stabilizing principle acting upon her inner structure. This leads directly to the fifth mystery. Christ claims that the name does not simply restore Sophia, it elicits a response. The document insists that true restoration requires cooperation. Once the name is emitted, Sophia begins to sing again, but her voice is no longer shaped by panic. Instead, it carries what the manuscript calls remembrance. Investigators interpret this as regained self-knowledge. Her cry becomes an affirmation of identity rather than a plea for rescue. The text reads almost like a psychological case study embedded in ancient cosmology. The Archon's influence collapses at this point. The manuscript asserts that they cannot remain in the presence of the name because their existence depends on instability. This is among the most philosophically loaded lines in the document. If taken metaphorically, it suggests that confusion cannot sustain itself once underlying truth is recognized. If taken literally, it implies that certain entities are structurally incompatible with higher order. Either way, the text portrays the name as something that forces maladaptive systems into dissolution. An overlooked component of this section involves the aftermath of Sophia's liberation. The manuscript states that Christ not only rescues her, but removes the scars of her fall. Specialists disagree on how to interpret this. Some view it as symbolic healing, transforming trauma into insight. Others see it as a literal purification of the distortions accumulated during her time in the lower realms. The important forensic detail is that the text insists Sophia does not simply return to her original state. She returns with awareness, which the document frames as an essential element of her transformation. Finally, the combined revelation of the fourth and fifth mysteries establishes a principle that governs the rest of the narrative. Ascension is not passive. Even the highest stabilizing force cannot impose restoration. The afflicted consciousness must respond. This idea appears repeatedly in esoteric literature, but Pistis Sophia expresses it with exceptional precision. Sophia rises not because Christ drags her upward, but because she recognizes the name and aligns with it. This prepares us for the final stage of the investigation. In the next part, we will examine what the manuscript claims about the destiny of the soul, the function of knowledge, and the ultimate purpose of Sophia's narrative. You should understand that the final section of Pistis Sophia operates more like a coded briefing than a spiritual conclusion. If you remain through the end of this segment, you will see why the ancient compilers embedded the final message behind layers of symbolic narrative. The document's last chapter does not simply celebrate Sophia's restoration. Instead, it outlines a framework for understanding how consciousness develops, stabilizes, and sometimes fractures under pressure. For Omniscient, this conclusion is critical because it reveals how the text's authors interpreted the human condition through the lens of cosmic mechanics. According to the manuscript, once Sophia has been fully restored, Christ gathers the disciples and explains the significance of everything they have witnessed. He allegedly tells them that Sophia's fall, confusion, plea, and recovery are not isolated events. They mirror processes that affect every mind moving through a layered reality. The text asserts that individuals confront internal regions that function like the eons, layers of clarity, layers of distortion, and layers where truth and misconception blend. This interpretation is strikingly modern in its psychological accuracy. Whether or not the narrative is literal, it describes a dynamic that many contemporary researchers would recognize as the architecture of human perception. One of the most revealing statements in this final chapter involves the responsibility attached to receiving higher knowledge. Christ allegedly warns the disciples that illumination can destabilize those who are unprepared. The text states that knowledge increases both clarity and risk. If taken symbolically, this resembles the idea that self-awareness exposes buried impulses or unresolved conflict. If taken literally, it suggests that beings who acquire higher perception attract interference from forces embedded in the lower eons. Either way, the manuscript's intent is clear. Understanding is powerful, and power must be handled cautiously. The document goes further by claiming that Sophia, even after being restored, must continue to develop. This contradicts later traditions that portray enlightenment as a final state. Instead, the text frames consciousness as something that evolves continuously. Sophia is not depicted as flawless after her ascent. She's portrayed as aware of her vulnerabilities, her strengths, and the structures that shaped her fall. Scholars note that this is one of the earliest esoteric texts to portray illumination as an ongoing process rather than a completed achievement. Another overlooked element surfaces when Christ explains that those who hear the story of Sophia are essentially hearing an encrypted account of their own inner landscape. The manuscript states that every individual navigates internal eons, regions where fear compresses perception, regions where partial insight masquerades as full understanding, and regions where clarity is fragile but attainable. This interpretation aligns with the symbolic model of consciousness, in which the outer cosmos mirrors inner experience. Researchers studying early Gnostic writings often highlight this feature. The external myth encodes an internal map. The narrative then shifts to a critical point. Christ announces that he will return to the highest realms, leaving the disciples with the responsibility of transmitting the material he has revealed. But he emphasizes that the transmission must be careful. Misinterpretation can generate new layers of confusion. According to the manuscript, truth must be delivered in proportion to the listener's capacity. Modern investigators view this as an acknowledgement of cognitive limitations, an idea surprisingly advanced for the document's likely period of composition. One of the manuscript's most striking claims appears near the end. The light does not disappear when Christ departs. Instead, it moves in silence, maintaining contact with every soul that attempts to reorient itself toward higher perception. Whether symbolic or literal, this statement carries significant philosophical weight. It suggests that clarity is never fully absent, even in states of confusion. The text treats the light not as an external reward, but as a constant presence, requiring recognition. The final revelation concerns the nature of the fall itself. According to the narrative, Sophia's descent demonstrates that misinterpretation, not rebellion, not corruption, lies at the root of most crises of consciousness. The text insists that confusion begins with a false inference, builds through emotional amplification, and becomes self-sustaining when unexamined. Once the chain is formed, the lower eons reinforce it. But the manuscript is equally clear that no descent is permanent. Even the lowest realms cannot extinguish the essential spark that defines an individual's identity. Investigators often argue that this is the most sophisticated aspect of the Pistis Sophia text. It portrays human error not as moral failure but as perceptual distortion. The recovery process is equally non-moral in tone. It depends on recognition, recognizing that confusion has taken shape and that the internal signal is still present beneath the layers that obscure it. The narrative suggests that any moment of clarity, even a minimal one, can begin a process of reorganization. The document ends not with triumph, but with a question implied through Christ's final instructions. The question is not written explicitly, but the structure reveals it. What will each listener do with the knowledge just received? The manuscript does not impose belief or demand allegiance. Instead, it suggests that every consciousness will eventually face its own descent, whether through crisis, error, or misinterpretation. And in that moment, the individual must decide whether to remain in fragmentation or call for alignment. This closing framework is what makes the Pistis Sophia so relevant to modern investigation. It offers not a doctrine, but a model. It treats consciousness as a navigational challenge, shaped by perception, misinterpretation, and the possibility of recovery. Whether one interprets the text as myth, psychology, or metaphysics, its final teaching remains consistent. The journey is ongoing, the structures are real in whatever sense they operate, and no fall eliminates the potential for restoration. With this, our examination of the 5 hidden mysteries of Pistis Sophia reaches its provisional endpoint. But as is tradition in Omniscient, we will not close the case. Instead, we open the door to the next one. The themes raised here, perception, distortion, layered reality, interference, and recovery, appear in multiple ancient sources. The question now is whether these patterns indicate shared symbolic language or a deeper, interconnected system preserved across texts.